Are we on? Okay. Excellent. Thanks, everyone, for joining us this afternoon in this session on unlocking carbon markets. My name is David Victor from UC San Diego and the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and I'm your moderator today. We have about 45 minutes, a huge amount to cover. The case for making deep cuts in emissions is very compelling. It's unambiguous. The question is how? What are the strategies that we're going to be following to reduce those emissions? And in particular, what's the role of carbon markets in that? It seems like today we are living in two worlds, almost diametrically opposed worlds. One world is where you look at the markets, they're exploding in size. We've had progress at COP26 with Article 6. The prospects look very bright. There are compliance markets, voluntary markets, a lot happening. The other world is a lot of concerns about quality of those markets, quality of carbon credits. Only 21% of global emissions are covered in one way or another by carbon pricing. The prices outside of Europe, for the most part around the world, are very low. And so how should we think about those two different worlds? And that's what we're going to be learning about this afternoon from this terrific panel that we have with us. And so let me first introduce the panel, then I'm going to introduce a special guest who's going to talk with us first, and then we'll come back to the panel conversation. But starting on my left, on your right, we have Minister Bahlil Lahadalia from Indonesia. Thank you very much for joining us. And next to him is Bill Winters, CEO of Standard Chartered. Next to Bill is Suzanne DiBianca, who's Chief Impact Officer from Salesforce. And next to Suzanne is M. Sanjay, who's CEO of Conservation International. Before we go to the panel, we're first going to have a few remarks from Alok Sharma, who is the president of COP26, the most recent Conference of the Parties in Glasgow, Scotland, a tremendously effective event. And so, Alok, we look very much to look forward to hearing your remarks and learning a little more about what you did there, and in particular the role of carbon markets in that. And Alok's going to come up here. I'm going to stand aside for a moment and look forward to your remarks.
David, thank you very much for that. May I ask, ladies and gentlemen, how many of you were in Glasgow 6 months ago? Very good. So one of the things that you will have noticed is that on the final day after we got agreement, there was a whole bunch of things that had to be gavelled through. And there were various sort of whoops and cheers as we went through. But I think one of the biggest cheers was when we gavelled through the agreement on Article 6. And, you know, I think one of the achievements of COP26 was that we were able to close off the Paris rulebook in its totality, and there were a number of items outstanding, and one of them was on Article 6. And I have to tell you, going into COP, there was a lot of skepticism. A lot of people told me that we wouldn't be able to get together, we wouldn't be able to agree detailed rules on dealing with voluntary carbon markets, but we did. And now some of the sort of technical follow-up work is ongoing. And for me, I think it was a big collective achievement by the international community, because what it means is that we're going to get finance flowing to climate. We are actually going to get some action when it comes to climate. But the reality is, and I think David talked about this, this is an issue about integrity, right? Both in terms of supply and demand. So I have just one ask of you, which is that we, as a COP presidency and as a UK government, are supporting the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative. And that is setting out its sort of draft terms of engagement, so to speak, I think next month. And what we would very much like is for all of you to engage with that, engage with VCMI, because if we're able to do that and we can have an agreement on how voluntary carbon markets are governed, but in a way that is Paris Agreement compliant, I think you're going to see what we all want to see, which is a lot of finance flowing in that direction, which ultimately is going to help companies and countries deliver on the Paris Agreement goal of limiting global warming to below 1.5 degrees. And that's why I think this is a tremendous panel, and I'm actually looking forward to hearing very much what they all have to say. Thank you, David. Short and sweet.
Thank you very much. Since it's so short, can I ask you one question?
Sure.
Before you leave us? Help us understand where quality is going to come from. You have on the one hand an agreement in Article 6. Everyone's thrilled about that. You have a variety of initiatives. When you look at the marketplace, where do you think quality is going to emerge, and what should we be looking for as that emerges?
So I think this is why I raised the point about the work that VCMI is doing, is that what I think you need to do is have an agreement on, what does a carbon credit with integrity look like? I mean, that's what this comes down to for us to have agreement on this. And by the way, I mean, just to expand this discussion a little bit, which is that we have the same issue when it comes to this sort of risk of greenwashing overall. So when when companies are making commitments to go to net zero, what is the basis on which those commitments are being made? One of the things that you've seen, and it was announced at COP26, the UN Secretary General has set out an expert panel looking at all of these issues, looking at the various methodologies that are out there right now, and basically providing a tick to say, well, actually, this is compliant with the Paris Agreement. So I think that's what we need to see is effectively a sort of set of rules that everyone agrees are going to show integrity in terms of the carbon credits that are emerging.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you, and thank you for your optimism about this.
You've got to be optimistic in this game, guys.
Thank you very much, Alok. Let me turn to our panel now, and first go to you, Minister Lahadalia. Help us understand the role of carbon markets. Let me first say, just to remind everybody, this is being live streamed. It's on the record. Reporting press are allowed. If you're on Twitter, I'm not on Twitter, but if you're tweeting up a storm, you can use the hashtags WEF22 or hashtag carbon markets, and then that'll tag that on Twitter. And then the session is also being translated in Bahasa Indonesia, so that'll be in the translation boxes that are on your chairs. I think channel 1 is English, and channel 2 is Bahasa. So let me first turn to you, Minister. Help us understand the role of carbon markets in the Indonesian plan for reducing emissions. You're doing all kinds of things with renewable energy. You've got a very ambitious nationally determined contribution. I know you're in the process of introducing a carbon tax in July this year. Help us understand what you expect is going to happen to patterns of investment in Indonesia as these carbon markets unfold.
Ya, baik. Terima kasih. Saya pertama tidak akan mengulangi tentang apa yang tadi disampaikan para pendahulu, baik itu tentang komitmen di COP maupun di Paris, dan juga bagaimana bahayanya ketika emisi ini tidak mampu kita talangi bersama, dan ini menjadi isu dunia. Tetapi ada sebuah kondisi objektif yang memang antara benua atau antara negara itu berbeda. Saya mengambil contoh katakanlah negara-negara berkembang atau negara-negara yang mempunyai potensi luas wilayah daratan yang cukup bahkan pesisir pantai. Saya ingin mengambil contoh katakanlah di Indonesia. Di Indonesia sekarang itu mempunyai 2 juta hektar lahan gambut yang harus dilakukan restorasi. Kita mempunyai 3 juta kilometer daratan yang 60%-nya itu masih ada hutan. 40%-nya udah harus kita lakukan reboisasi. Kita juga mempunyai garis pantai yang kurang lebih sekitar 86.000 kilometer. Dan ini disitulah ada letak mangrove dan juga adalah terumbu karang. Nah, apa yang terjadi? Saya pikir ini menjadi isu yang harus sama-sama kita siasati. Yang pertama, regulasi untuk Indonesia, bahwa Presiden sudah mengeluarkan peraturan Presiden nomor 98 tahun 2021 tentang bagaimana penanganan karbon dan harga karbon. Beberapa keputusan-keputusan yang dilakukan, kami melihat rasanya itu belum ada satu asas keadilan yang fair, terutama pasal 6. Di mana negara-negara berkembang itu harganya dihargai $10. Negara-negara maju dihargai sekitar $100. Sebagian, bahkan ada juga di situ dikatakan dari harga reboisasi atau perbaikan terhadap hutan yang sudah ditebang dengan memelihara itu juga berbeda. Kondisi objektif pada negara-negara berkembang dan negara-negara yang mempunyai cadangan-cadangan alam ini, rata-rata penduduk masyarakatnya itu di sekitar hutan. Dan kami jujur mengatakan bahwa masyarakat itu membutuhkan lapangan pekerjaan. Tatkala kita meminta mereka untuk kemudian tidak boleh menebang pohon atau harus memelihara hutan yang ada, pertanyaan berikut, pendapatan dari mana mereka dapat? Inilah problem. Nah, bagaimana Indonesia menyikapi hal tersebut? Bahwa Presiden Jokowi berkomitmen untuk kita akan masuk pada zero emisi pada 2060. Tapi tahapannya harus dilakukan. Kami menawarkan, sekarang para investor kalau mau masuk, monggo, silakan. Kita tadi saya katakan bahwa untuk lahan gambut ini kan 70-80% kontribusinya ketika terjadi kebakaran. Nah ini saya Pak Darsono ini kebetulan salah satu pengusaha di Indonesia yang sudah main karbon kurang lebih sekitar 15 tahun terakhir. Dan ini cukup bagus. Nah di sisi lain regulasi kita sudah membuka sekarang. Saya undang teman-teman yang melakukan investasi ini. Seluruh perizinannya kami tanggung. Kita akan urus dengan perhitungan yang win-win. Jadi nggak boleh ada standar ganda menurut saya. Ketika ada satu upaya strategi standar ganda, di sinilah kegagalan kita semua. Dan harus fair, harus terbuka. Kenapa harus saya katakan fair dan terbuka? Baseline perhitungan nilai karbon sampai dengan sekarang, satu kelompok tertentu, satu perusahaan perhitungannya beda dengan perusahaan tertentu. Karena frame-nya belum ada. Satu. Yang kedua adalah siapa yang membeli. Hari ini di Indonesia, mungkin Pak Darsono punya jaringan itu, tapi yang lainnya enggak. Apalagi karbon yang bisa dijual oleh kelompok masyarakat di sekitar wilayah hutan. Saya punya satu kekhawatiran, Pak Moderator. Ketika ini tidak mampu kita mediasi dan mitigasi secara baik, maka saya tidak menjamin rakyat di sekitar hutan itu akan memelihara hutan. Saya enggak yakin. Dan negara-negara berkembang itu belum punya cukup kapital untuk melakukan investasi hal ini. Karena ini butuh kolaborasi yang baik. Nah kalau ini mampu kita lakukan kolaborasi yang baik, silakan investasi untuk di Indonesia, saya akan bantu seluruh perizinannya dengan perhitungan yang win-win, monggo kita bisa melakukan hal ini dengan baik. Saya pikir itu beberapa pandangan saya awal untuk membuka diskusi ini.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that, and that resonates very much, I think, with the remarks from Alok in the beginning. So I want to bring in Sanjay on this. The minister has laid out a vision where the carbon markets draw in capital investment and create benefits, win-win, on the ground, and that creates incentives to protect nature, peat, mangroves, forests, coral reefs. Conservation International, is working all around the world on these kinds of projects. Are you seeing this starting to happen? What's the role of carbon markets in creating that kind of investment, and what should we be looking for in terms of projects that actually generate these kinds of local benefits?
Great. Thanks, David, and very much agree with the comments the minister made and the clarity that Indonesia is hopefully going to provide in the coming months on this market. So here's what is kind of most amazing to me. We've been in the carbon market for a long, long time. Over a decade. And for the most part, it was a very small part of the work that we did. A big carbon project would be, say, a $5 million project in one site. That was the case, I would say, 3 years ago. Today, it's $200 million in, 5 sites or 10 sites per company. Per company. I just used the 200 million just as a yardstick. The growth in this has been dramatic to the point where we are in this incredible moment where we're far more supply constrained than demand constrained. And the supply that the companies that we work with want are high quality, pro-biodiversity, pro-people carbon credits. And that's hard to do because there's enormous amounts of challenges out there to do that quickly and do that in less than, say, 2 years and get those supply to the market in a thoughtful way. So for us, the standards that we apply, and I'm just speaking very broadly, tend to be, at least 50% of the revenue needs to go to the local communities or the indigenous peoples on much of the land on which we work with. So the lion's share must go to the communities. That is sort of number one for us. And then we want, obviously, high carbon density, high biodiversity, multiple benefits. But then importantly, also, we want to make sure we're doing this with companies that are already on a path to net zero. And so for us, our principle is that if you need to be on a path to net zero, a credible path, and you're using this natural climate solution carbon market as a way of accelerating that curve, rather than simply continuing to, create emissions on one hand and then trying to offset it on the other, right? So those are some of the, and then good verification and monitoring. So that's what, in our opinion, it takes in order to create high-quality carbon credits that the minister and David were asking about. Now, what do I see as the barriers to this? What I don't see the barrier is money, which is an amazing thing to say, because I'm in the conservation world. We've spent my whole life basically asking people for money. And no matter how generous our donors have been, the amount of money we raise for conservation is not even a drop in the bucket. It's like once you empty the bucket, the water left behind type of thing, right? It's the dampness. That's all we've managed to raise thus far. And then all of a sudden, in one moment, you finally are seeing the kind of funding that meets the problem at hand, that can scale to the challenge we have. I see it as potentially the greatest wealth transfer, frankly, from those who have and the developed world to the global south. I don't think it lasts very long. I think the gap we have is maybe 10, 15, 20 years. I think after that, the carbon capture technologies will start being an actual solution at scale. So it's ours to lose or win. And if we get this right, we will protect forests. It'll be pro-people, pro-biodiversity, pro-Indonesia. If we get this wrong, it will be greenwashing, and we would have missed the one chance we have to actually conserve very large parts of the planet for a global good. The big barrier, I said money is not the barrier. I'm being a bit tongue-in-cheek. Some money is the barrier, but it's not really the barrier. The real barrier right now is clarity. And that's what has been lacking. And I think that's what Bill's been working on, the minister's working on, and others. And what I mean by clarity is in the absence of governments stating clear rules, it's been left to the nonprofit sector and, frankly, the companies to come up with our own rules. And that's an amazing and scary place to put an organization like CI in. So, yesterday I was speaking to the minister from Ecuador, the new Minister of Environment from Ecuador. He's interested in his country's carbon markets, but his constitution is vague. So it allows them to sell oil, but it won't allow him to sell a natural climate solution. That's kind of an amazing thing. So basically, if you take those trees, wait 300 million years, he can sell it. But he can't actually do anything with it now. So that kind of clarity is really important, and desperately we need the signal from the United States on what they see as the right approach to this, because I think that will immediately shift and signal the market. So those are, in my opinion, what the major barriers and opportunity is to what I think is a very exciting market.
Let me pick up on this clarity issue and quality. Bring in Suzanne and Bill and talk about the markets themselves. Maybe start with you, Suzanne. I see on the one hand this explosion in volumes. It's just extraordinary what's happening. Big projects, $200 million projects. And on the other hand, you see a lot of concern about quality. You and your company work with suppliers and users of these credits. Your own company buys these credits. How are we going to deal with the quality problem? How big of a problem is it? And how are you thinking about it?
Yeah, thank you, David. I mean, first of all, in my view, you must have an emissions reduction target as well. We have a 50% absolute reduction target by 2030, fully net zero by 2040, but you can't get into this game in a credible way if you don't have a real science-based target. I think that's where the greenwashing element comes in. So I think a lot about that. Sanjay talked about the supply and demand problem. This is quickly changing. And we're seeing demand outstrip supply on an ongoing basis. We do a lot of work with Conservation International, and these are some of our projects. As we think about credibility, there's a lot of innovation in this space. We have an entrepreneur in the second row, Diego running Pachama, who has done some incredible work in the carbon markets. And they're using all kinds of technology, satellite, LiDAR technology. Another entrepreneur, Silvera, is here at World Economic Forum, is doing a lot of work on the credibility side. So I'm seeing a lot of innovation. I'm seeing a lot of technology, again, satellite, LiDAR, the best technology, however, is people. And incenting people on the ground to be really engaged in these projects. We always plan for loss. There's always floods, there's fires. So, we think a lot about additionality. as we sort of plan our budgets. But I'm really excited for the explosion in the market. And we think about carbon in sort of 4 categories, right? The blue carbon, we've talked about mangroves and oceans, talked about the green carbon around forests, the brown carbon soils, massive potential in soils, and gray carbon. And we're really excited to beginning to get engaged in the carbon removal and direct air capture space. I agree with you. I think in 5 to 10 years, that'll be humming. And
You think 5 to 10? I said 10 to 15.
I'm gonna.
Okay.
We'll make a bet on this.
All
Somewhere
of
around
us
a
are going to be
decade.
alive for that to check the forecast.
Yeah. So, and in which case, I think credibility changes, in that as it relates to the kind of gray carbon category. So that's how we think about it. But I'm really excited about the innovation and the entrepreneurs that are engaging in this space.
I want to bring in Bill here and help us understand the larger picture. We have all these things going on with carbon markets. This is now not a hugely traded asset, but is rising very rapidly. But it's also happening in the context of a global energy crisis. Just moments ago, President Zelensky called for actually much more aggressive sanctions, which presumably would raise energy prices further. A couple hours ago, there was a session this morning about the global energy markets, where half the people said the crisis in Ukraine is going to accelerate the transition, and the other half of the people said it's going to have the opposite impact. Help us understand from your perspective, your company, your bank is right in the middle of trading this. Do you see the big rise in prices and the growing concern about high energy costs as taking the air out of the carbon markets? Do you think it's going to accelerate investment in this area? How should we think about the big picture?
I think both sides of the question that you posed and the answers that you got are very present. And Sanjay talked about the tremendous financing gap that exists, which has been closed for big parts of the world, but is wide open in others. So in developing countries, the financing gap to convert these projects into reality is massive. We're talking trillions of dollars. Probably $4 trillion of financing gap. So it's not that the money isn't there, it's just not always being directed in the right places. So on the one hand, if there's any silver lining in this war, it is that the price of energy is high and the focus on energy security is high, and there is a massive investment into renewables right now or alternatives, and that's clearly a good thing. The flip side is that the cost of living crisis, which obviously begins with energy prices but extends to food and pretty much everything else that we consume on the planet, is putting tremendous financial pressure on the poorest countries and poorest people in the world. And we have to solve both those problems. We have to capitalize on getting all that money from what's waiting to be invested in scale into high quality projects and high quality solutions, including investments in research, which will get us to this 10 to 15 or 5 to 15 year. And by the way, if we don't solve the nature problem first, it doesn't matter what technology we build today, it will be too late. Right? So we must remember that there is a solution out there, but it can only exist as a solution if we solve the protection of the existing carbon sinks today, starting, and Sanjay and company have been doing it for quite a while. So where are we? We've got a tug of war going on. We've got to solve 2 problems at the same time. In order to solve that direction of money, this wealth transfer that Sanjay talked to, we clearly have to have a level of standardization that doesn't exist today. So the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Markets has formally constituted last year to set a level of standards that will, by charter, by commitment, coming out of a task force that I chaired, be set at a very high quality standard. That's the intention. I'm sure that that's what we will deliver. To do that in a granular enough way so that people can say with confidence, I'm putting my money into something that will not be questioned in terms of the efficacy of this project. And once that standardization is in place, we can unleash a lot of this money. We can seriously ramp up the projects that are being created, and Conservation International, of course, is at the very, very heart of that. But there will be a flourishing industry if we can get that money pipe working faster and better than it is today, and if we can do that with confidence. That also has the effect of putting companies like Standard Chartered Bank or Salesforce or anybody else that has made a net zero commitment. It puts us directly in the limelight. We have no excuse but to, one, exactly as Salesforce is doing, reducing carbon emissions in every way that we can, but then taking those difficult or impossible to abate remainders and using the offset market as the most effective way to make a contribution to net zero. at the end of the process. It's your mop-up. It can't be the core. But once we have that standardized market in place, and we have a clear articulation, as the minister said, of what the demand side integrity is. What is a net zero commitment? What does it actually mean for a corporation? How's it going to be checked? How's it going to be audited? And that's what VCMI is doing. So this Integrity Council, VCMI, working hand in glove to make sure that both sides of the equation are covered. If we do all that, we can solve this problem.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to have members of the audience to ask questions, but let me just do a couple very quick follow-up questions before we go out to the audience. Let me start with you, Minister. All the other panelists talked about competition. There are other technologies coming along that are going to be reducing carbon, and there are other countries coming along that are also making offers, like Indonesia, to protect their forests, mangroves, and so on. What is it that you're doing that's different, that sends a signal to the marketplace that Indonesia is the place to invest?
Selain apa yang tadi saya sampaikan tentang tawaran lahan gambut, kemudian mangrove, tapi ada satu ekosistem industri yang dibangun di Indonesia untuk mendorong kepada green energy. 2 tahun lalu, kami pemerintah Indonesia melakukan pelarangan ekspor ore nikel. Kenapa kami lakukan? Karena kami telah melakukan penelitian bahwa proses penambangan nikel itu betul-betul merusak lingkungan karena tidak memenuhi kaidah-kaidah tertentu. Maka kemudian kami mendorong untuk membangun ekosistem baterai mobil. Dari tambang, smelter, prokursor, cathode, sampai dengan baterai sel. Ini adalah bagian kontribusi Indonesia untuk menurunkan emisi dan tata kelola lingkungan yang baik. Tadi Pak Bill tadi mengatakan bahwa lingkungan salah satu hal yang penting. Tapi apa yang terjadi? Harus jujur kita katakan bahwa sebagian negara di Eropa melakukan gugatan itu ke WTO. Padahal ini adalah niat baik Indonesia untuk memberikan kontribusi terbaiknya untuk menjual produk barang jadi yang menjamin dengan memakai energi baru terbarukan, dengan penataan pengelolaan lingkungan yang baik yang memenuhi kaidah-kaidah. Dan ini adalah sesuatu yang harus dilakukan. Saya pikir hampir semua negara. Ini yang kita lakukan di Indonesia. Kedua, adalah persoalan sawit. Kami telah melakukan pengelolaan kebun sawit dengan memperhatikan rekomendasi dari global. Tidak lagi kita menebang. Kita sekarang sedang melakukan moratorium penebangan hutan untuk menjadi kebun sawit. Tapi kita melakukan reflecting sawit dengan melakukan kaidah norma dalam rangka penanganan lingkungan. Tapi apa yang terjadi? Hasil sawit kami di-ban oleh Eropa. Dan waktu itu kami nggak boleh ekspor. Dan kemudian kita menggiring itu menjadi B20, B30 untuk melahirkan green energy. Tapi ketika kita menyetop ekspor sawit kami, baru 3 minggu kemarin, dunia mulai meminta, kenapa itu di stop? Kami butuh. Jadi menurut kita, menurut kami, ini nggak fair. Jangan ada aturan yang standar ganda. Yang ketiga, batu bara, saya setuju sama Pak Bill. Batu bara pembangkit listrik di Indonesia, kita sekarang udah nggak mengizinkan untuk pakai batu bara. Bahkan kita akan mengurangi ekspor. Tapi apa yang terjadi ketika kita menyetop ekspor batu bara pada 4 bulan kemarin, hampir semua dunia meminta untuk kami membuka ekspor itu lagi. Jadi sebenarnya kita ini mau konsistenkah mempertahankan regulasi ini untuk kita menurunkan emisi? Atau ini hanya sebagai standar ganda untuk menekan satu negara tertentu. Kecurigaan ini yang selalu terjadi. Jadi menurut saya niat kita baik ini akan bisa terwujud kalau ada satu persepsi duduk sama rendah, berdiri sama tinggi. Di semua dunia sudah merdeka, nggak bisa lagi ada yang mengatakan bahwa dia yang lebih hebat daripada negara lain. Karena ini persoalan dunia. Jadi kami pikir bahwa apa yang kami lakukan di pemerintahan Pak Jokowi sekarang adalah betul-betul kami mendorong untuk membangun hilirisasi industri yang berbasis pada energi baru terbarukan dan ramah lingkungan. Bahkan saya juga menyampaikan dalam rangka mensiasati itu untuk SDM kita mulai tahun ini akan rencana melarang ekspor boksit. Karena boksit ini juga sangat berdampak pada lingkungan yang luar biasa. Kami ingin tata dengan baik. Di tahun 2023 awal kemungkinan besar juga kami akan menyetop ekspor timah. Karena timah ini sebagian lokasinya di pinggir pantai yang akan merusak terumbu karang dan sebagian adalah mangrove. Dan pasti dunia akan mulai keberatan lagi dengan isu ini. Dan saya lihat gejala itu sudah ada. Yang saya ingin sampaikan adalah, ayo kita kolaborasi bersama. Kita ingin melahirkan produk yang hijau, tapi juga kita ingin suatu kolaborasi yang saling menguntungkan dalam rangka investasi. Itu, Pak.
Thank you very much for that. Let me follow up with Bill exactly on this issue. Ministers laid out a whole package of things that are happening in Indonesia, and yet the rules keep changing. It makes it pretty hard to do long-term investments. As a banker, is the Indonesian program, is this what you're looking for projects that are going to be viable so that ultimately carbon-based investments can be sustainable for the long term? Or what, as a banker, do you still need to see to make some of these investments flow?
No, I think Indonesia presents some of the most fantastic opportunities for carbon protection in the world, both because of its the nature of the terrain, and also Indonesia's willingness and foresight in terms of promoting these activities. So I think of course we were all encouraged by the progress on Article 6 in Glasgow. But not every detail has been worked out in terms of the interplay between voluntary carbon markets, for example, and various compliance markets around the world, and the various national accounts. And I think until some of those issues are worked out, and some of that will require legislation or clarity, judicial clarity at a local level, so in Indonesia or in other markets, some of that needs to be agreed multilaterally. But I think it's very important that we get as close as we can to a single market for carbon globally, and a single price for carbon globally. I'm not naive enough to think we're going to get all the way there very quickly, because different governments and different regimes have different objectives. But broadly, if we can get to broadly the same place, then we've got a tremendous pool of liquidity and a tremendous pool of understanding that can converge on solving these problems. But I do think there's a bit more both legislative, judicial, and market clarity that's required to get fully there.
Let me ask you, Suzanne, a lot's happening, but when you look at the trajectory of effort, it doesn't add up to 1.5 degrees. It maybe adds up to 2.5 degrees. Maybe we can be more optimistic than that. What do you, as someone who's in the middle of the markets, whose own company hinges on these markets along with serious pledges to make emission reductions, what do you want to see inside the markets that would make carbon trading take off in a greater way? Bill pointed to the need for more international standards, building on Article 6, more global trading. Is that how you see it, or do you think that the kind of key actions are elsewhere?
I think standards are critical. I think regulation is critical. I'm a big proponent of with the work the SEC is doing in the United States for disclosures. I also think that buyers' alliances are really important. We set up something called the Blue Carbon Buyers Alliance, so that we can create a community of practice amongst companies, so that we have common language, we have common standards, at least that we're using in the absence of anything in the regulatory environment. We set one up for renewable energy called REBA a few years ago. The same is true, Buyers Alliance that we've set up to scale carbon removal technology. So I think that what you're seeing in the corporate sector is, in the absence of standards, that we're creating them ourselves, right or wrong, but we need to hold each other accountable. And we have to be really transparent. I think there's a little bit of a crisis of trust, both on the supply side and on the demand side. And so, bringing transparency is really key. All of our projects, we put up on our website, for example. And I'm also thinking a lot about sort of small and medium-sized companies. For the enterprise, you can bring a lot more resource as you think about certification, monitoring over time, and partnering with, various brokers and consultants. But the small and medium-sized businesses, I think, are really struggling here. So this is why I think these buyers' alliances are really critical to do that, and they can really kind of draft off what the enterprises are learning.
Let me go, last follow-up question to you, Sanjay, and then we're going to have time for a couple from the audience. We're going to run over a couple of minutes. Well, it should be net just at 45 minutes. A lot of companies in the room. I'm curious, you've made the case that 50 to 80% of the resources, revenues, benefits from these projects need to flow to the local communities. A lot of companies are focused on carbon, and maybe they're doing work for local communities. I'm just curious as to what should we think about the role of companies in originating these kinds of projects, or do we need some new kind of institution? Do we need governments to get better at in effect, being governments? What's the critical thing that needs to happen to make sure that more of the benefits flow locally?
It's kind of amazing because I was just sitting here thinking of what you just asked me, and we hadn't discussed this before. So you're hitting on a really important point. So for those of you not in this, typically how this works is that companies either go and shop from companies who just do carbon development all over the place, or a company will approach us and say, can you develop X, Y, and Z project for us on this time scale? I don't love that model. And I'll tell you why. It's like if any of you go to buy a car, certainly in the United States, I don't know how well this applies globally, but in the US, if you go to buy a car, the first question the car salesman asks you is, do you have a car to trade in? And the minute you say, yes, I have a car to trade in, now this salesman has two numbers he can play with, right? The price of the car and how much he's going to give you for your old car. That's exactly what tends to happen when you have a bespoke project for one company and they are pushing you to develop it. My preference is to have great high-quality projects going to a consortium of companies who can pay the highest price in order to do that. And that way, companies too can also hedge things, right? Because if you, as Susanna said, you have to do a little bit more than what you need because some will get lost. There could be a fire, there could be floods, things happen, governments change, right? So, but there's no great way to do that right now. And here's the tragedy of it. We actually use philanthropic dollars, so charitable dollars, to actually develop these projects. And that ultimately is not scalable. So we need to find a way to actually scale the supply side, develop high quality projects without having an immediate one-on-one buyer, and then try and get the best price from responsible companies, like Susanna was saying, who are already on a pathway to net zero and only using this to accelerate the curve. Now, I'll take one issue with one thing you said. The companies we work, which is companies only focused on the carbon side of it, that's not actually correct, in my opinion, on the companies we work with. They're really interested in the human story. In fact, because at the end of the day, when they put out the ESG report, most people are going right down and seeing what their total number is, and they're getting there and then they're moving on. But that human story that we can tell, which we can actually tell better than a gray story, right? A giant machine sucking carbon from the atmosphere can't really tell a story. This one can. And every single company we work with, whether it's Apple or Salesforce, is really keen on the human element. How are you helping communities? How are they being empowered, particularly rural communities in Indonesia, in Colombia, in Kenya, other places like that.
Excellent, thank you very much. Time for a couple questions. Start here in the front row, Aaron, and then if everyone could be very brief. You're going to get a microphone. Tell us who you are, and rather than a dissertation, just give us your question. There you go.
Great,
Aaron, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, David, and thanks to the panel. This has been a really fascinating panel. Aaron Bloomgarden, founder and executive director of Emergent. We are the manager of the LEAF Coalition, and so LEAF Coalition has mobilized a public-private partnership to work with jurisdictions, so countries and states that reduce deforestation. And so back to the question of scale. I think what we need, the filter here is we need scale and we need it very fast. And so how do we do that? Because this is an unprecedented scale that we need to achieve and through global cooperation. So two answers that we have to that, or at least our theory of change. One is work at the jurisdictional level, right? Nothing wrong with projects, but zoom out, work at the jurisdictional level, and find ways for effective public-private partnership. And so we have 25 companies, including Salesforce. We have 3 countries, US, UK, Norway. And what they're doing to allow us to do what you said, to develop the projects, is they're providing us a buyer of last resort. But let me come to the question. Sorry.
Thank you. The question has been lurking.
And just to acknowledge that, right, we've mostly been talking about voluntary carbon markets, which last year were $1 billion of value. This year it'll be orders of magnitude larger, but still a fraction of what compliance markets are. And compliance markets, most people have never heard of. They're about $500 million. sorry, $500 billion rather. So the question is, how do we transition this voluntary market into that market, into compliance and regulation? Is it the SEC? Is it cap and trade programs, right? Where does it, what's the vision for the future, right? And maybe Bill.
If the compliance markets were complete and if they were working perfectly, there would be no need for a voluntary carbon market.
Right.
It's as simple as that. The voluntary carbon market only exists because governments have failed. To be direct about it. So that's it. How do you get convergence? Governments do their job. I'm not going to bet on it. Right? I'm not going to bet on the governments doing their job. So let's get the voluntary carbon market scaled to the greatest possible extent. If we can create interoperability in terms of creating getting a common level of high quality standards between the voluntary market, where the standards are being set objectively. I mean, I can tell you the Integrity Council is setting standards objectively. Governments may or may not set targets objectively. They've got political considerations. So we'll set the standards. They'll be very high. If compliance markets can pick those up, then we can have some exchange.
Yeah. Second row question? Right in the middle of the second row. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. My name is Aviv Tzidon, and I'm from the Technical Pioneer, invited to be here 3 years in a row. I'm trying to think as entrepreneur, and the numbers of damages of fires is 20-30% of carbon emission. You don't need anybody's help to go for reducing fires. And if with technology, with the right monitorings and immediate respond, big fires always happen, and you start to accommodate that 6-8 hours afterwards. So project can be active, and then you are in a way insured your programs without saying flood or fire. You can protect your programs like insurance. So what do you say about being active?
Sanjay,
I'd say yes. I mean, you're completely
Good
right.
answer.
It's not always easy to do this, particularly in remote places. We have a program in the Americas called Firecast that talks to park managers instantly using cell phone technology to alert them to fires. But you're fundamentally right, and that technology development needs to happen in order to be able to prevent these catastrophic fires. I don't mean prescribed burns, but catastrophic fires, particularly in the tropics, from happening.
Just to your right, sir, just to your right, the mic was going to go just to you. Exactly. We have, I think, one more question here, then I'm going to say a couple words to close, please.
Thanks a lot. Sylvia Union from Brussels Hub, Global Shapers. I'll be super brief. I just have a question because you talked about how important it is for the US to send a signal. And I looked at Gabon and what Gabon has done, previously to the COP, and the work that they've done in terms of linking carbon credits with actually green bonds issuances and really gathering, companies' interest from all around the world. So I wonder, do you think maybe there wouldn't be any space for maybe a bottom-up approach from other countries that are not, maybe the US themselves, but maybe more developing countries that really take initiative on the carbon market sphere? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Suzanne, you want to?
No, I was still thinking about wildfires.
Well, no, so the answer,
It's a lot of innovation, by the way, happening there as well. The X Prize is doing a big thing on wildfires just coming up in the next quarter. But you know more on this.
No, I mean, you're completely right. My only comment on the United States is they've been a bit silent on this. They're starting to say stuff. They need to say stuff, partly because they need to create the signal for companies to do it. I will say, however, that as much as I respect the United States, the Great Britain, and Norway in creating some certainty on jurisdictional approach, at the end of the day, the standards that they're trying to apply just won't work in Liberia. It won't work in Cambodia. It won't work in Vietnam. And I don't know about Indonesia. It needs to be bottom up as well. And I think the time of dictating what we are going to do to them and vice versa, those days are so over. And I'll be the first one to, we need to do it in a different way. I think Gabon's trying it. I'm hoping the Indonesians will clarify it. And private sector has to have a role because, yes, we want ultimately governments to work perfectly, but look at education. Of course, it's the role of responsibility. There's plenty of private schools out there too. Yeah. You need both.
Model of brevity, a very brief question, sir. Very, very briefly.
Well, thank you. My name is Barry Martin with Rabobank, very interested in agriculture. My question is actually very simple. We have a food crisis. We need to reduce carbon emissions. We have regenerative agriculture, but we have no idea who gets actually the credit for that. And I just, maybe the government way, why can we not make clear the farmer gets the money if he does the right thing? So that's my question to you.
Yeah, and I see a lot of heads nodding, and we're going to.
I mean, the answer is, I think yes.
Yes.
That is yes, and
Why we don't do it?
well, I think the tenor of the remarks from the minister are also that the rules are constantly changing. I mean, we're in the middle of a huge food crisis, and we are doing almost all the wrong things in terms of creating more confidence inside the markets. My job as moderator to do two more things. First is to just give a brief summary. I just want to say that at least three things came out of today's panel. One is that a lot is happening, and there's a huge search for clarity and standards, and I think there's going to be a tension between getting standards and also getting quality. We have to be careful that we don't standardize too quickly. Second is, I completely appreciate the comments about the need for more globalization and integration in global markets. And also compliance markets. My guess is we're in for a lot of chaos, in part because my country, the United States, is not going to send a clear signal at the federal level. It will send a signal, and then 4 years later, it will send another signal. So
3 years later.
3 years later, time is speeding up. So that's the second thing. And the last is I just want to pick up on where the minister's remarks began, Sanjay, where you pointed us, which is ultimately this is about using these markets not just around carbon, but to draw investment into the local level, and that's going to require more collaboration, better models, better documentation of those models. I wish Indonesia great success in doing this, really becoming a model. I want to thank, the last thing I have to do as a moderator is to thank our 4 terrific panelists and thank you as an audience for a terrific discussion.
Thank you.
Take the show on the road. Thank you.